Much, Chris. Before we get started, take inventory, please. Each one of you needs two pieces of paper. One is a letter-sized piece of paper. It says organ vision statements at the top. Second one says organ timeline. That is a legal-sized sheet of paper to be held horizontally. This is an update. We still need some more handouts? Raise your hand if you don't have one. This is an update on what our organ task force has been up to for the past several years. We're going to start off with a little history lesson, get a sense of what it is that is in the church today, and then we're going to continue to what they have produced, which is this vision statement. So the story for us today begins in 1774. By that point, our congregation had been formed 44 years prior. We already had the old organ from our original church, and when we constructed the new sanctuary across Mifflin Street, we brought that organ with us and we transferred it into the church. In 1772, we commissioned a builder named David Tannenberg, based up in Lidditz. He was a Moravian, to construct a new pipe organ. He completed that instrument in 1774, and that is the first date. You can follow along on your timeline here. In 1774, what did the organ consist of? Everybody loves toys and paper dolls, so I've got paper dolls right here. The organ consisted of what you could see from the outside, that is the cabinetry and the visual facade pipes, facade meaning that they're in the front. And much like your car, you open up the hood and it's got an engine and a transmission and all that stuff on the inside of the car. There is also more of the organ inside the cabinetry. So in 1774, it consisted of a case, which was actually built by a subcontractor out in Germantown, and then all of the inner parts of the organ that were constructed by David Tannenberg, the pipes, the wind chests, the keyboards, etc. And that, at the time of its construction in 1774, was the second greatest pipe organ in all of the Western Hemisphere. We came in second just behind Mexico City Cathedral down in New Spain. But apart from that, this was the best there was in the Western Hemisphere. Follow along on your timeline. That instrument served us magnificently all the way up until the 1850s. At that point, the organ was replaced by a builder named Henry Nauf. We have records from this time where Henry Nauf says the organ is absolutely hopeless, there's nothing we can do with it. And so Henry Nauf replaces the organ, but he doesn't do all of it. Okay, what does Henry Nauf do? Henry Nauf removes the inner parts that were constructed by David Tannenberg, and instead he puts his own parts inside the existing case. So at this point, in 1854, what do we have? We still have the 1774 case and the pipes in the front of that case, but the inside has been changed at this point. So at that point, that's Henry Nauf on the inside. That instrument serves us for a little while. In 1886, we have a firm from New York named Hilborn Roosevelt. Hilborn Roosevelt replaces the organ. So he leaves the case, takes out the parts from Henry Nauf, and then he installs his own parts. But Hilborn Roosevelt's vision for the organ, his design, doesn't fit. So he kind of shoehorns it in and kind of fits it in as best he can. And then Roosevelt goes bankrupt 2 years later. And so 6 years after Hilborn Roosevelt replaces the organ, we brought in another company by the name of Bernhard Muddler. And what does Bernhard Muddler do? Well, he dismantles it, okay, and he takes the case and he does something kind of about a lot like this. And then he expands expands the case sideways. So the organ now looks like this. And lo and behold, now Roosevelt's organ fits inside. So that's 1886, Hilborn Roosevelt does what he does, and then 6 years later, Mudler comes along and expands the case and fits everything properly in. That serves us until 1923. In 1923, a Canadian firm by the name of Casavant Frères comes along, removes the Roosevelt parts from the inside, and inserts their own organ. So at this point, 1774 cabinetry, expanded in 1893, and in 1923, Casavant organ put in. That organ serves us from 1923 until 1962, when the Moeller Company from Hagerstown puts this out. And they install their organ inside, but they add so much to it that they also add these guys. And that is what you see today. So they added 2 soffits. Those of you into kitchen design, you know what a soffit is called, with exposed pipes along either side. That continues from 1962. And from 1962, it's more or less a constant period of experimentation and adjustment. We worked with the Moeller Company for about 10 years, from 1962 to 1972. Tried tweaking a couple of things, saying, well, if you take that, and does that work a little bit better? No, let's put it back that way. No, maybe that works a little bit better. Shifting pipes around, trying to make things different. We let the Moeller Company go in 1972, started working with a local company, the SDG Company. It was called something different at the time. It was Jim McFarland. And experimented for the better part of 50 years to see what we could do with the instrument as it stands. That culminated in 2001 with an extensive rewiring project performed by the SDG Company, also using subcontracting help from Walker Technical Services out in Zionsville and Columbia Organ Works up in Canada. And that continued basically till the present day. In 2014, late in 2014, early in 2014, Pastor Menser and I said, hold on, time out. Let's start to think a little bit more strategically about this. And so we began a long process of education and discernment about the organ. This has taken the form of several lay academies. This has taken the form of field trips. This involved the 7 members of the organ task force, some of whom are here today. This involved consulting with a large number of experts. Folks where we went to visit them, they came to visit us. We've had Skype conferences. We've passed emails, diagrams, blueprints back and forth. We've had a large number of folks come through this, and we've gone to visit a large number of places. And that is summarized over here on this bulletin board. This has been hanging outside my office for the past 3 years. This documents all of the various activities that we have been engaged in as part of this process of education and discernment. And so you see us going out to visit different places. You see different people coming to visit us. You see different experts. This is us out in Philadelphia, in New Jersey. This is an instrument right here in downtown Lancaster. We went out to Philly, where else? Oh yes, all the way down to Virginia, all the way out into Paoli and Great Valley. We've been really active, trying to figure out what's going to be best for the church. And it's no exaggeration to say, this is amazing to look at this. I encourage you to come up and take a look at this afterwards. I can point them out to you in there, but all of the various experts that we've had coming to talk to us, if you add it up, we have well in excess of 500 years of experience represented on that board. So what has that gotten us to? The task force submitted to the vestry at the end of the last year this vision statement. The task force was only commissioned in order to carry out a process of education and discernment. They were not given a mandate to conduct action. They were not given a mandate to raise funds. They were not given a mandate to commission anyone or enter into any contracts on our behalf. But based on all of the work that they carried out, we started to get a very clear sense of, okay, what should happen here? What would be good for Trinity Lutheran Church as we enter the 21st century? I'm going to walk you through the 9 points that they put into this vision statement. The first one is that we would be well served by, and that's how all of these are going to take the form of, it would be good if blah, 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 blah. Okay? We would be well served by dot, 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 dot. Number one, we would be well served by an instrument that is appropriately sized and correctly placed. Organs are not one size fits all. An organ has to be constructed so that it is the right size for whatever building it is in. Our building is a certain size. There is a certain range of what would make sense for the size of an instrument to go into that sanctuary. It's a range. It's not an exact number. You can be a little bit on this side, a little bit on this side, but you've got this sort of Goldilocks range that's not too small, it's not too big, it's just right. The instrument as it stands today has been diagnosed by every single expert that has come through as being too large. So we would be well served by an instrument that is smaller, more compact, and correctly placed. What does that have to do with it? We're going to talk about the acoustics of the sanctuary in a little bit, but our sanctuary is kind of strange in that the center of the sanctuary is the best place to make sounds. It's the best place to make music. The way the instrument is currently designed, the primary voices of the organ are not directly on the center line, where they originally were in 1774. They're actually way off to this side. And this causes problems. This causes negative feedback loops where, because they're off to the side, they're not in an ideal spot, they have to push harder. And they don't sound as pretty as they possibly could. Number two, the church at large would be well served by the positive example it would set if our congregation were to obtain such an instrument. So guess what, guys? You are special. All the other Lutheran churches in the synod look up to you. Trinity is a very significant congregation. And just anecdotally, you all recall the story in the gospel where Jesus says, "Woe to you who would lead one of these little ones astray. It would be better if a great millstone were hung around your neck and you were cast into the sea." So it happens frequently during the summer that I'll be in the church practicing, and one of our downtown walking tours will come through. So it's half a dozen people, 20 or 30 people, being led by one of our tour guides wearing the three-cornered hat and the leg stockings, and he shows them the boot scraper outside, and he brings them in. And I'll be up in the back of the church making noise, and I see these folks coming in, and then just out of courtesy to let them do what they need to do, knock the organ down or just stop playing for a bit so that they can talk and have their tour. And the tour guide carries them in, and they all sort of walk up to the front, and they're all looking around saying, "Oh, windows, windows," and then they turn around and say, "Whoa, look at the back." But then they look to the side, and they see these, and they say, "Ah." And then they look in the middle and say, "Whoa," and then look to the side and say, "Ah." I said, "Whoa." And there's this, you can see this every time a tour group goes through. There's this sort of cognitive dissonance that goes across people's faces. And the tour guide explains to them when the organ was built, all of the history that goes into it. And it's got all the latest technology, and it can play jingle bells with the sound of barking dogs. And everyone in the tour group is saying, "Ah," okay? It's one thing for that to be just a matter of what's happening in this church. What keeps me awake at night is the thought that there's probably some other congregation elsewhere in the synod that is going to think, okay, if this is what Trinity has done, this is what we should do as well. That scares me. I would like to see this church set a better example for the synod. Number three, our congregation would be well served by an instrument designed to last for generations with simple maintenance. This was one of the most joyous discoveries for some of the instruments that we went to visit, is just how simple they are as machines, as far as keeping them running as far as if something goes wrong, can you figure out what it is? For several years, I drove a Mercedes C-Class wagon. Delightful car, 6 cylinders, had all sorts of get up and go. But God help you every time you take that thing into the shop. The parking brake cable snapped. And I brought it into the shop because I didn't have a parking brake. I wanted a parking brake. The guy comes out and tells me, well, I've got good news and I've got bad news. The good news is a replacement Mercedes parking brake cable costs $20. And I think, great. Bad news is we have to remove the entire drivetrain to get to it. And so you're looking at about an $800 cost just to fix a $20 part. The way the internal arrangement of our instrument is constructed, it makes maintenance very difficult, if not outright impossible. When something goes wrong, I'm pretty much helpless. All I can do at that point is pick up a telephone and call an outside contractor who will then have to come in with a crew of 2 guys charging hourly rates, and they start poking around, doing exploratory, take this apart, poke this, see if it does something. I am not as useful to you as my training would otherwise make me. Okay? I've worked for organ builders. I can fix things. Okay? On a well-designed instrument, if something goes wrong, I'm in there, I will fix it, and it'll be done 5 minutes later, and it doesn't cost the church a dime. That's not something we can do with the instrument as it stands today. It would be really good for the church going forward if we had something that was maintainable. Number 4, our congregation as a worshiping body would be well served by hiring a specialist to propose improvements in the acoustics of our sanctuary. Acoustics, that's the study of how sound travels. What does it sound like? You have something that's making sound over here. How does the sound get to this listener over here? How well does that work? This is important not just for the organ, but as it says, our congregation as a worshiping body, because this impacts very strongly upon congregational singing. Now, I've been here for 4.5 years. I've started to notice certain patterns of behavior. Whenever the topic of congregational singing comes up, what's the first thing everyone does? Everybody raises their hand and says, I'm a terrible singer. You really don't want to hear me sing. Why? This is frustrating because it's not true. I've been a church musician for over 20 years. I have visited many congregations which are genuinely terrible at singing. This is not one of them. You guys are fantastic at singing, and yet every one of you is so stinking self-conscious about it that the first words out of your mouth is, I'm a terrible singer. One of the reasons is the acoustics in the church. The acoustics in the church are working against us. When acoustics work well, congregational singing is a joyous affair because you can lose the sound of your own voice into the great big sound of everybody else in the room. That's not happening right now because our sanctuary has a large number of little dead patches all over itself where you're there, you're singing your head off, and you're sort of dimly aware that there's people out there, but you can't lose the sound of your own voice in the sound of everybody else's voice. The result of this is that it feels like you're all by yourself. You feel lonely, and you feel self-conscious about what your voice sounds like. If we do nothing else, number 4 here, this is the single most important thing on the list. If we do nothing else with the organ, fix the acoustics, because that will pay massive dividends in worship, and even just the organ as it stands today will sound measurably better just by fixing the acoustics. Number 5, all musicians who pass through our sanctuary would be well served by a responsive musical instrument which encourages and rewards a player's best efforts. Responsive. How much detail does the player have to put into the instrument? How much detail is going to come out of the instrument based on what the player is putting into it? The instrument as it stands today is not particularly responsive. So you put a top-notch organist on the bench and he's practiced for weeks, he gives it 100% of his best effort, the organ sounds, that's kind of nice. You put a guy on there who doesn't know what he's doing, hasn't really practiced very much, the organ sounds, it's kind of nice. It's that sort of deadening middle-of-the-road effect. A stronger instrument, a better constructed instrument, has a certain responsiveness to it. So if somebody has been practicing really hard, that shows through with a lot of clarity. If somebody hasn't been, that also shows through with a lot of clarity. Number 6, the value of our church to lovers of history would be well served by an organ which celebrates David Tannenberg's position in the history of North American organ building. Okay? This timeline began with me removing something from here and crumpling it up and throwing it at Dave Warner. Folks walk into this church and they see what they see, and then there's this cognitive dissonance when we tell them, yeah, but what was inside there, we threw that away 150 years ago. We would be well served by something which celebrates the history of our church. Number 7, our congregation would be well served by an instrument which builds bridges within the congregation and within larger communities as well. When the instrument was constructed in 1774, the Moravians from up in Lidditz sent a band of trombones to come for the dedicatory festival. Why? Because you can never have too many trombones. That's why I cast an answer. When the instrument was dedicated as it stands here in 1962, the local chapters of the American Guild of Organists and the Organ Historical Society came through to attend the dedication. Several of them sat through the concert with their hands over their ears. They left in 1962 and they have not been back since. We would like to see this as an instrument that helps build bridges to the larger community as well. Number 8, our sanctuary as an example of fine architecture would be well served by a careful restoration of the organ casework and the stained glass windows on the south gallery wall. If you take a look at your organ timeline here, the second illustration, okay, where you see 1854, that's the famous picture from the centennial, and you look on either side of the organ. What do you see right next to it? So just above the doors that lead into the gallery. What do you see? Sally? Yes, indeed. So, when these soffits of exposed pipes were added in 1962, they covered over 2 window openings. Those window openings are on the south wall of the building. They originally brought in a substantial amount of natural light. And guess what? I've got some good news for you. We still have those windows. Those windows have been sitting in the boiler house since 1962. And the organ casework as well. You saw that when I went and modified this, I took some scissors and snipped things out. Be happy to take any of you into the back of the organ to take a look at it. But what's left of David Tannenberg's casework from 1774 is kind of precariously propped up from the back, just sort of like an old Hollywood set piece from one of those Western movies. And number 9, not only our congregation, but the church at large would be well served by continuing efforts at lay education concerning pipe organs. What's the other thing that I hear from a lot of people? Well, I don't know anything about music. And you're putting yourselves far too much. Okay? Because what we did, the educational work that the Organ Task Force did, there were some choir members in there, there were some folks who were not musicians. And yet everyone in the Organ Task Force came away from this saying, yeah, I get it. I understand it. This is not magical witchcraft. This is not something that is completely beyond a lay person's powers of comprehension. It would serve the church well that you don't get yourself in a situation where you're dependent on experts to tell you what is good. That's why I did a lay academy. That's why I've done a forum on this. That's why I took the task force on field trips. That's why I filmed documentaries for them. All of this is stuff that you can understand if you just take a little bit of time to educate yourself about it, and then you can make decisions for yourselves about what would be best for the church. With that, I have one last little bit of show and tell. We can probably do questions first and then finish with something fun. Does that sound about right, Tim? All right. So the time is now 10:30. I've got a job to do in about 22 minutes. The floor is now open for questions. Jay.
When the Horton task force made its rounds.
Jay, could you hold up for just a second? Let Dave get over to you.
Can you hear me? I have a loud mouth. This is the best compliment I've received in my life. My wife would always say, tame it down, tone it down. When the task force made its rounds, looking at existing organs, was there one or two that served or came out as a perceived model of what we would emulate here?
No. Were there one or two instruments that were an exact model of what would happen here? No. The ones that we visited, any number of them would qualify as a potential example of this would be a happy ending, this would be a happy ending, this would be a happy ending. So no, we did not pick one and say, okay, copy this and we're done. Okay. Chuck.
Rob, on a budgetary yearly basis, what would you say it costs Trinity to keep our current organ running on a yearly basis?
On a budgetary basis, we yearly budget approximately $2,000 for tuning. Generally, we don't use all of it. I can only speak for the past 4 years, first and foremost. I've done a substantial amount of maintenance in-house since I've gotten here. So tunings, fixing minor details. I've tried to avoid leaning on the maintenance budget as much as I can. Prior to that, probably $2,000 to $3,000 a year. For comparison, we visited other churches where the maintenance budget is basically $0 a year and has been for over 15 years because everything can be done in-house. Alan?
Yeah, your number 4, on number 4, the acoustics in the church. Could you give me a simple example of what kinds of things could be done to improve that if it needs to be improved?
What kinds of things could be done to improve the acoustics of the church? This one, since this report was submitted, we already have contracted a specialist to come in and make a report. His name is Christopher Brooks. He's based locally, but he works for a firm that's based in New York and Los Angeles. And he comes through, and we popped a bunch of balloons while he had his little magical electronic device to measure things. It was just a great fun time. Took some measurements, looked around, and his job as an acoustician is to propose a scale of things that could be done and then potential benefit that you might reap from that. It's not an exact science when you're dealing with existing buildings, so he can't give us exact predictions. But at the low end, some of the smaller things that we could experiment with in-house, removing some of the cushions from the pews up in the galleries. Pull those out, see if that has changes. Modify the floors of the gallery. One of the problems, the big problems that he noticed is that the sanctuary is currently sliced in half horizontally. You've got a lower half and you've got an upper half. And those two cubic volumes are not working together. They're not playing well with each other, and they're cut in half by the galleries. He did cite for us an example that we need to investigate. There's an opera house out in Delaware where they actually made balcony floors transparent to sound, not visually transparent, so you're not staring up someone's skirt, but transparent to sound so that sound from the bottom can go up to the top and then back down and up back, so you can make those balconies transparent to sound. And then other things, you know, in gradually increasing orders of severity. But he had all sorts of different ideas. Okay, Dan, you had a question? That was the question. Okay. Kevin.
All right. So, would it behoove the congregation to hold off on the ceiling work in the event that some of the acoustic recommendations would include any alterations to the ceiling, so we don't do repairs only to turn around and make changes for acoustics?
He'll have his report done well before that becomes an issue. The way things have been going with the ceiling, we're still in the figuring out process. Dave, that wasn't a criticism of you. So to answer your question, should we tell the property committee, don't even look at this, don't just stop looking at the ceiling because we're not ready? No. The property committee can keep on doing what they're doing with the ceiling. And truth be told, in terms of the acoustical problems that he diagnosed in the building, the ceiling really isn't the biggest one. Sally. Dave?
If you sit underneath the balcony on the first floor, if you sit underneath the balcony, is that considered a dead level as far as sound of the organ or any music?
Yes.
I mean, temporarily, couldn't we just close that section off, which would move everybody forward anyway?
Ladies and gentlemen, Sally Dash. Going once, going twice. Sorry, Angie.
Are there maintenance issues that could possibly cost a lot in the future?
Okay, so repeat your question.
Are there maintenance issues that could possibly cost a lot in the future?
Oh, and the answer is absolutely. The instrument is designed from the ground up to incur a six-figure expense basically every 40 years. The instrument dates from an age, or at least the technology, the overall infrastructure of the instrument, dates from an age when materials were very expensive and labor cost a nickel a day. So it gets us back to this question of why was it so expensive to fix the parking brake on my sport wagon by Mercedes? Because labor no longer costs a nickel a day. So the instrument is filled with parts that are individually very cheap, and yet you have to tear the entire thing to bits to fix them. And those things need to be fixed just the way it's designed, basically ballpark once every 40 years. I had a question over here. Sorry, that answered your question, Mark? Okay. These are all very good questions. I want to emphasize to you that nothing is happening right now. This is all education and discernment. The task force submitted this report to the vestry, and you see down at the bottom, they recommended that the vestry, A, declare their work complete because they've been working on this for years and they need to get on with their lives. And we don't believe that the only way to get off a committee in this church is to die off of it. And then to form an organ committee tasked with the realization of this vision. And that's the job that the vestry is going to take up next, is to pick an organ committee which is designed to make this happen. Barry, you had a question?
Yeah, Rob, we added a lot of gadgets a number of years ago. Would it prolong this decision or some of the large expenses if we just disabled some of that? Is that where some of the issues are?
Unfortunately, no, it's not. No, that really wouldn't change anything. As you say, the gadgets that you described there, they're very much peripheral to it, and they're not, they didn't really change the infrastructure of what it was in 1962. Dan, you had a question? Tasked with the realization of this vision in time for the organ's 250th anniversary in 2024. That seems like it's a ways off, but we need to get on this sooner rather than later. One of the things that we want, just sort of as a central guiding principle in this, in fact, to answer your question, Jay, is there one thing that we want to take from this? Is that whatever we do in the future, we want to work with good, top-notch people. Those top-notch people, we've met several of them have come to visit us, several of them have gone climbing around inside the organ. I know a number of them personally, I've worked with them in the past. Those people currently have backlogs and waiting lists. They're working all the way out to 2023. So even if we're not ready to do anything right now, we need to start working with someone to say, okay, this is something we want to make happen, this is something we want to realize, so that we are in the running with them. Okay? Because when you deal with the good people in organ building, this is a really good problem for the field to have. They're booked 5, 6 years out. One of the top builders in the country today, Paul Fritz and Company out in Tacoma, they just signed a contract that's not going to be done until 2027. Okay. So in order for us to work with the good people who are going to help us realize this vision, we need to make sure we get on that early. Guys want to play a little game? All righty. So you see up here on the show and tell table, not only do we have my wonderful little paper dolls, we've got a set of 12 organ pipes. So as part of that process of experimentation that was going on from 1962 well into the 2000s, people were shuffling pipes back and forth, trying, okay, well, if we take these pipes from here and put them over here, oh, there's this church that just threw away an organ, we can get some used pipes, what if we try putting them in here? In all of the shuffle, there were 12 pipes that went missing. They're not that important. I'm going to tell you right now, once I install these in the organ, it's not revolutionary. It's not going to change everything about the organ. But just to give the organ a bit more dignity, I decided to go through, I'm going to make 12 replacement pipes. So I worked with an organ builder up in Montreal, took all the measurements we needed from the existing pipes that were still there, and then extrapolated. And then down in my basement, I took some of the scrap wood that was liberated during the renovations to the HVAC system, and I went ahead and gave us these guys. This is a set of 12 wooden replacement pipes. It's going to be probably another 15 to 20, maybe even 25 to 30 man-hours to get these installed, to get them racked, to get them voiced, and to get them all tuned. But once that's done, then the organ will have these guys back. So what we can do right now is I can get 4 volunteers, and all you need to be able to do as a volunteer is when I come up behind you and tap you on the shoulder, you need to toot. Show of hands. Who thinks they could do that? Beth is one. Come on up, and come on up. One more.
Sally, you spoke up. Come on.
You've got hot air. Come on.
All right, so can I have you stand in a row? This way.
Take my lipstick off.
Sally, you get the big one. You can go ahead and give it a try if you want. You get this one. You and... Yeah, oh, you can go ahead and hit it. Don't be afraid of them. All right.
We're going to play a tune.
Give it a nice big 2. 2, 2. There you go. That's a little too hard. Okay, so stop for a second, guys. When I come up behind you, I'm just going to pat you on the head, and I need you to toot and hold it until I let go. Okay? All right, so now that's your practice run. Here we go. Ready? And...